So today we're going to be talking about Sir Francis Drake, one of the most famous people in maritime history, an explorer, a privateer, an admiral, a naval war hero. And it's really a sort of a resume that you're not going to find anywhere else in maritime history. First of all, here's our man, Sir Francis Drake, 1544 to 1596. And while I was preparing the lecture today, I got to thinking, well, how does this fit in with a couple of the other lectures that I gave? The one on the Age of Exploration and the one on the Golden Age of Piracy. So let's see how that fits. Right smack dab between the two. Age of Exploration, according to the materials I used, ended 1550. He was born 1544. Golden Age of Piracy began at 1600 and died in 1596. So it's a perfect segue from one of those lectures to the other. Perhaps next time I'll insert it between the two. So a little bit more about Sir Francis Drake. Eldest of 12 sons, Protestant farmer. His dad lost the farm when there was religious conflict, and apparently that part of the land was taken over by the Roman Catholic folks in that area, and that began his lifelong hatred of the Spaniards, because of course that was a Roman Catholic country. He was such a complex individual. I think if he were lying on a psychiatrist's couch, that psychiatrist would have his hands full, because he was both friendly and courteous, but also ambitious, bold, and greedy. He could be very kind and very liberal with prisoners, but ruthless with anyone who defied him. And he was a little bit paranoid in terms of his subordinate officers. He was always looking for perhaps insubordination on the part of the officers working for him. He went to sea early at the age of 12, apprenticed on a bark that was doing cross-channel commerce. The master of the bark, who owned it, had no children, and he was so impressed by Drake that when he decided to retire, he gave the vessel to Drake. And so Drake very early had a lot of responsibility. Now, one of the things that's very important in getting a job or in advancing in employment is something called networking. It's really true that who you know is just almost as important as what you know. And he was very fortunate in terms of having a family member, John Hawkins, who was the foremost seaman of the 16th century. And in fact, Hawkins mastered the expedition that made the first English slave trading voyage, the very, very first one. And at the age of 18, Hawkins' cousin, Drake, went along. And so he began to have some really remarkable experiences very young in his life. And Hawkins made a second voyage. Drake was along with him then. And he made a third voyage in approximately 1569. Rather large fleet, 6 ships, 600 men. You can see the route that they took. They leave Plymouth, England, and go down the coast, pick up the slaves in Guinea, and come across to Spanish colonial America. Now, and this was their proposed route to return. Now, at that point in time, and actually for a long time before and after this, the Spanish crown totally restricted any trade with the colonial Americans. Nothing could be sold directly to the Spanish colonies by anyone other than a Spaniard. And so it turns out that they would have to sort of go through a kabuki dance in order to do trade with the New World, for an Englishman to do trade in Spanish America. So one of the ports that they came to was Santa Marta in current-day Colombia. And this is the step-by-step process that was followed in every port that they went into. Of course, they had what they were marketing were slaves. Formal request for license to trade to the mayor. Formal refusal by the local officials. They wanted those slaves, but they could not accept the request for trade without going through a charade. There was a brief battle. A few men might be killed along the way, a number captured. And then over the next few weeks thereafter, there'd be a lot of trading of slaves for whatever materials the Spaniards had, under the guise of ransom payments and reimbursement for damages. So this is sort of the dance that happened in every port. It's really an interesting way to do business. Well, they completed the offloading of their slaves, and they were heading back to England with their loot, their booty, and then a major storm happened in the Strait of Florida, and they were blown backwards into the current-day port of Veracruz. The ships were damaged. They really needed to take shelter and repair before they began their cross-Atlantic voyage again. Now, let me just sort of do a little back step here for a moment. This was the time of Spanish treasure ships. Treasure ships a fleet would come over from Spain, and it would break into two parts. The Tierra Firme group would go down to Cartagena and Portobello and gather in all of the wealth that had come up from Peru, from the Inca. And then after they had loaded up all of that treasure, they would go to Havana and wait for the arrival of the Flota group that had gone to Veracruz, and they then loaded up the riches of the Aztec Empire, and whatever other riches came from Mexico City or from the Orient, because there was trans-Pacific trade going on at that point in time, and Spanish ships would come from the Philippines and offload their silk and so forth in Acapulco. At any rate, all of that was gathered in, taken to Havana, and then these two groups would join up again and head back to Spain. Well, it just so happened that, oops, I'm sorry, okay. I hadn't read this part here. Just 2 days before Hawkins' ships entered the port, it was 2 days before the arrival of this treasure fleet. And the Spaniards, at this point in time, Spaniards and the English were in a state of undeclared war. There were all kinds of problems going on. The King of Spain and the Queen of England, even though they were related, they hated each other, and there were all kinds of various skirmishes. And so, as you can imagine, the Spaniards were very, very suspicious when this English fleet showed up 2 days before the arrival of the treasure fleet. And so, this is the town of Veracruz. There's an island out here. And so there was a very constricted anchorage. Not a well-protected harbor, but at least it did provide some protection from the ocean. And Drake's ships were in here. They'd gotten permission to enter under the condition that they repair and get out of town as quickly as they could. And it was at that point, 2 days later, the Spanish fleet arrived, and Drake, in effect, had possession of the harbor. And so there was sort of a negotiation that took place. I said Drake, I meant Hawkins. Hawkins was in charge. Hawkins negotiated with the Enriquez, who was the admiral of the Spanish fleet, and said, okay, we'll let you enter the harbor and be here in the harbor with us as long as we'll just not have anything to do with each other. Hands off. So that fairly large treasure fleet sailed into the harbor, and they were right next to each other, within a stone's throw of each other. All of these ships of very hostile nations. Enriquez broke that agreement. He decided he'd had enough of the English. He was going to destroy them. And early one morning, an English lookout noticed that army troops were being loaded onto the Spanish treasure ships in order to begin an attack at daylight. Cannons were fired. All of a sudden, hostilities broke out, and Hawkins' fleet lost 4 ships, 500 men, and their entire loot. It was a horrible situation, a turkey shoot in a very, very constricted area. Only 2 ships got away. The one that Hawkins commanded and the one that Drake commanded. So they went back to Spain, and Drake's hatred of the Spanish was really anchored in now a desire for vengeance. And he raided the Spanish Main just a couple of years later. Again, this is a map of Panama during colonial times. This is the Camino Real. All of the treasures of the Inca would be shipped to Old Panama or Panama City, and then shipped across the isthmus. And initially, Nombre de Dios was the terminal point for the Camino Real. Later on in history, Portobello became that major terminal point. So Drake raided Portobello and actually was able to capture it. And he was, before they could put all the treasure back on the ship, he was badly wounded, bleeding very, very badly. And they withdrew without being able to take along the treasure with them. And there was a lot of treasure that they had to leave behind. So he gained valuable experience as an independent commander. This was really his first independent command. And he hadn't planned as much as he wanted to, and he did some impulsive things that ended up being problematic for his fleet. So he started to gain valuable experience as an independent commander, and this the first of his independent commands. While he was in that area, he became the first Englishman to see the Pacific Ocean. There was a very, very tall tree, not too distant from Nombre de Dios. He climbed the tree, he saw the ocean, the first Englishman to do so, fell to his knees and prayed that he might someday navigate that mighty sea that he could see way off in the distance. So he returned to England, and at that point in time, Queen Elizabeth had become aware of his exploits and was wanting to give him some special responsibilities. Since Roman times, there had been a legend or a myth of a Terra Australis Incognita, south of the tip of South America, somewhere out in the southern Pacific or northern Antarctic Ocean. And she decided that she would send Drake in search of that mysterious land. But there was sort of a hidden agenda here, a hidden protocol. In addition to exploring, being the first English explorer into the Pacific Ocean, he had a secret agenda: plunder Spanish ports. We would gladly be revenged on the King of Spain for diverse injuries that we have received, said the Queen to Drake. Apparently there had been all kinds of, a little bit short of war, but lots of hostilities. And she wanted him to poke the King of Spain and cause his life to be complicated. So they set sail December 1577. Small fleet of 6 ships, 164 men, not a really large expedition by any means. His flagship was called the Pelican. And when it was built with a double oak hull. Again, the main reason for this trip wasn't necessarily exploration, but rather to embark on some hostilities. So that double oak hull was to repulse cannonballs shot by the Spanish. And as we'll see a little bit later in the lecture today, that double hull ended up saving Drake's life and the life of all of the sailors with him. So they sailed on down the eastern coast of South America, and the word got out among the members of the expedition that, hey, this isn't just exploration. This is also going to be a raid on the Spanish. And not everyone was excited about that. Along on the trip were a group of nobility, lower level nobility. They apparently had used their connections to get onto the list of individuals going. But they were not happy with the way things were going. And so as they were sailing down the eastern coast of South America, it became clear that there was dissension in the ranks. And about the time that they reached the point called San Julian, it sort of came to a head. And I didn't mention this in my lecture on the golden age of exploration, but at that very same location, Magellan had hung 2 mutineers. And in fact, the gallows and the bodies, what was left of them, was still evident 58 years later. And Drake said to himself, this is where I'm going to make the point that we are not going to have any dissension in the ranks. He selected one of the nobles, a man by the name of Thomas Gotti. Gotti had sort of enraged Drake because he had accused Drake's brother of stealing from the ship's stores. And so he decided he would make a very stern example of Thomas Gotti. And in fact, Gotti was tried and beheaded. Again, this sort of paranoia about dissension in the ranks, it seemed to be a recurring theme throughout Drake's career. But this act of beheading a member of nobility established for the first time the principle that the ship's captain was absolute ruler regardless of rank or social class of the passengers. Apparently up to that point in time, if there was high nobility among the passengers, they might overrule the captain. This was sort of the precedent that was followed thereafter in English maritime circles. Now, you might not have heard of the Pelican, and that's because Drake's ship is now known as the Golden Hind. And apparently he felt like he was sort of on thin ice now, having executed a member of the nobility. He needed to curry favor with the court of home. And so the captain of the Queen's Guard, one of the most influential people among the Queen's group, his crest had a hind. A hind is a deer. And so in order to curry favor with that very influential individual, Drake named his ship the Golden Hind, and that's what it has been known thereafter as. They entered the Strait of Magellan, which we talked about the other day, and apparently at this point it was a terrible passage for them. Many people died of hunger, disease, exposure to the elements. And by the way, of the 6 ships that initially began the journey, 3 of them by that point in time had been destroyed. First of all, there were so many losses of life and along the way that they didn't have enough people to man the ships. So one of the ships was burned and the other 2 were destroyed in some fashion. So only 3 ships entered the Strait of Magellan. And apparently while they were passing through the Strait of Magellan in dire hunger, they came across an island where there was a flightless fowl about the size of a goose. And so they replenished their larder by killing several thousand of these flightless fowl. And if you think about the location in the world, I think you'll figure out what we're talking about. They exited the Strait of Magellan and ran, unlike Magellan, who entered a very smooth ocean and named it the Pacific, he entered into the teeth of a storm. And they were blown way, way south, 700 miles west and south, way off the route that they had decided that they had planned on taking. One of the ships went down. One of the ships went down with all hands. Now we're down to 2 ships. And another one of the ships lost contact with the flagship, the Golden Hind, and it returned to England. So now there was only 1 ship left. the Golden Hind with Drake and his crew. They proceeded to sail up the west coast of South America, making stops, various stops along the way. When they reached Arica in Chile, one of his recorders said, "We sailed to a place called Arica, and being entered the port, we found the three small barks, which we rifled, and found on them 57 wedges of silver, each of them weighing about 20-pound weight." So in other words, they started their plundering in this location. They proceeded up the coast to current-day Lima. They sailed into the harbor there. There were 7 large ships there. They plundered the ships, and the Spaniards were just totally amazed. There had never been enemy ships in the Pacific. This was a total astonishment that all of a sudden an enemy ship would sail into their harbor. The masters and merchants, having never been assaulted by enemies at this time, they feared the approach of none such as we were. It was almost like they were aliens from another planet, sailing into their harbor and taking their wealth. And while he was in Peru, looting Peru, he heard about a treasure ship that was somewhere to the north. And so he sailed off in search of it, and he found it at the Cape of San Francisco, which is just north of, I guess, the border between Ecuador and Colombia. It was called the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción. It has the nickname of Cacafuego. So they sailed, they were able to get close enough to the Cacafuego by pretending that they were, that their ship was clumsy. They threw wine barrels overboard and dragged them behind it, and it made the ship look slow and clumsy, a typical pirate trick, and sailed up close. The first broadside took down the main mast. They landed on board very quickly. The Spaniards did not put up much of a fight. And what a marvelous treasure they found. We found in her great riches as jewels and precious stones, 13 chests full of reals of plate, 80 pound weight of gold, 80 pounds of gold, 26 tons of silver. In fact, there was so much loot that it took them 6 days to offload all of that treasure onto the Golden Hind. And they had so much silver that they threw out their ballast and replaced it with silver. They had almost too much loot to take back home. So this is right where we are right now in our story. And they were deciding, hey, it's about time to go home. Let's head back to England. But he realized that he had poked the bee's nest, and all of the ports and all of the Spanish naval ships were waiting for him to make his return journey back the way he had come. So he decided, based on the information that was available to him and other mariners at that point in time, to go north and then sail back to England in this fashion. A little bit of a problem with the maps at that point in time. They had no idea that North America extended so far north. So with that intention, he sailed up and he kept looking for a northeast passage and could not find it. Sailed as far as the Oregon Dunes, right about there in Oregon. And that is quite a bit north, and they just realized that when they reached there that there wasn't any opportunity to sail back to England that way. This, by the way, is what the Oregon Dunes look like today. My wife took that picture a couple of years ago. So here they are, up here, Oregon Dunes, actually right about there. They knew enough about the ocean currents. We talked about those the other day during the lecture on the Age of Exploration. And he realized that he could not sail due west because of the prevailing current. And so he decided they would go back down and then take this current across. Apparently there was enough knowledge to know that that was the best way to cross the Pacific Ocean. So they sailed down into California, and there's a bay not too far from the San Francisco Bay Area, just a little bit north, called Drake's Bay. They have actually found archaeological evidence that this is where Drake anchored. This is what it looks like today. He knew that there's certain things had to take place before they could cross the Pacific Ocean. One of them was that his ship that had been on the ocean for so long needed to be careened. Now what we're talking about there are a lot of marine organisms, shellfish, barnacles, seaweed, and so forth that adhere to the bottom of wooden boats. Tons of organic matter that, unless they are removed, it slows the boat down by at least 50% in terms of its speed. And so it was critical that before they embarked across the Pacific Ocean, that those barnacles and various other organic matter be removed. And not only was it for that purpose in terms of being able to make a more expeditious passage, but also there are shipworms, tornado worms I think they're called, that will actually burrow into the wood of the hull and honeycomb it so it almost becomes like Swiss cheese in terms of its appearance and its strength. So they realized they had to take care of that, and they were doing that at Drake's Bay. And careening, by the way, involved these 4 steps. Find a gently sloping beach, fresh water nearby, because this is going to take a while. It takes weeks. Heel the ship over by shifting the cargo, and at low tide, then they can go in and scrape all of the organic matter off the bottom, and then they do the other side in a similar fashion. So they did that. They loaded up with fresh supplies as much as they could, and they embarked on their journey across the Pacific Ocean, which, as you might imagine, was a horribly arduous journey. Lots of problems with scurvy. Fresh water was an ancient memory. They had supplies that were hardly edible, but they were able to make the journey across the Pacific and entered the Spice Islands. We talked about those the other day, how the Portuguese had discovered the Spice Islands. And in fact, they ended up going to Ternate and Tidor, which again was the only place in the world where cloves were grown. And he was able to cultivate a relationship with the ruler, Sultan Babu, and apparently the Sultan's father had been killed by the Portuguese, so he was very anxious to ally with another country that would protect him from the Portuguese. And since Drake promised English naval protection, he decided that he would give England exclusive trading rights, and in addition, as a matter of a generous gesture, gave him 6 tons of cloves. Very, very valuable. The Golden Hind sailed again to the west, and shortly thereafter ran into a horrible situation. About 8 o'clock one night, they sailed up onto a reef, and they were stuck there overnight and into the next day and into the afternoon, and everyone was pretty much giving up hope that they would be able to survive. And apparently Drake, during this whole ordeal, was optimistic. He was courageous. He rallied the troops. We lighted our ship. In other words, they threw overboard 3 tons of cloves, 8 pieces of ordnance, cannon, and certain meal and beans. And then the wind drove our ship off the rock into the sea again, to the no little comfort of all of our hearts, for which we gave God such praise and thanks. The double hole saved the ship. If it had been a single hole, it would have been caved in, and that would have been the end of the journey. They continued their journey without any really significant problems, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and arrived in Plymouth, England, from which they had departed 2 years and 10 months previously. They had been given up for lost. The people who backed the expedition, the Crown, said, 2 years, 10 months, they probably are not ever going to come. And so they sailed into Plymouth Harbor. And he became the first captain to sail his ship around the world. Remember, Magellan didn't quite make it. He was killed in the Philippines. So Sir Francis Drake became the first captain to sail, circumnavigate the world. He wasn't sure about what kind of a response he would receive from the Queen. He had sort of taken the orders to poke the Spaniards a little bit and cause them to get a little angry, and what he had done was so outrageous and provocative that he was afraid that the Queen would execute him if he was still alive. He didn't even know if she was still alive. And so they anchored, they stayed on this island for several days after the message had been sent to the Queen that they had returned. And he just wasn't sure what kind of a response he would receive from the Queen. So the Queen's message in response to his inquiry was stern in tone, but gentle. Fear not, but bring samples. She had heard that a Spanish treasure ship had been taken. She was really anxious to see what kind of goodies he brought back. 100,000, he met with the Queen and gave to her 100,000 pounds in gold and silver, a diamond cross, and a crown in which there were 5 emeralds, 3 of them as long as a finger. She can imagine if there was any reluctance on her part to welcome him back, it was totally wiped out at that point in time. He became her confidant. In fact, he was in her presence every day. This commoner all of a sudden became one of the greatest celebrities and one of the most influential people in the court of England. In fact, she decided to knight this commoner, something that was really most unusual. And this is this picture and this picture portrayed the way that particular experience of him being knighted, and it did not happen that way at all. The queen is the king or the queen is the one who puts the sword on the shoulder and indicates that they have been knighted. Well, she sailed up to the Thames to where the Golden Hind was anchored, boarded the ship, along with the French ambassador to England. She took the sword in her hand and said, "My royal brother, the King of Spain, has demanded your head." And Drake is probably thinking, "Oh my gosh, what's going to happen?" And then she handed the sword to the ambassador from France. We shall ask Monsieur to be the next man. And he, and again, this is very unusual, someone other than the reigning king or queen actually knighted Sir Francis Drake. What is the importance of this? She was sending a message to Spain that I don't care. That, in fact, I'm not afraid of you. And France supports me. Even though we took all that treasure, we're not sorry at all. In other words, she was poking him in the eye in the fashion that the knighting took place. Well, again, Drake was sort of the apple of her eye, and he could do no wrong, and she sent him on various raids, blockaded one of the major ports in Spain, Vigo, plundered Santiago and the Cape Verde Islands, sacked Santo Domingo in Hispaniola, captured Cartagena, one of the most important ports in South America, went up to Florida, raided Fort Augustine, and even further north, replenished the Walter Raleigh settlement at Roanoke, and raided Cadiz, another very, very important port in Spain, where he destroyed a lot of Spanish vessels. So his reputation, which was so huge before this, now became even greater. He was the most famous man in England other than the Queen. Just a few years later, the King of Spain, Philip II, had had enough. He put together the largest fleet in the history of the world, over 130 of the largest ships in the world, and they sailed for England. Actually, they were sailing towards the Netherlands, where they were going to pick up an army of 50,000 men and transport them over to England, where they would then overthrow the crown and he would become the king of England and Spain. That was the plan anyway. Now, the two navies had very different styles of naval warfare. The Spanish, with their huge, cumbersome ships, wanted to fight at close quarters and board. In other words, they would try and close with the English, get on board. They've had a lot of troops on their ships, and in effect, beat the English by overwhelming them in hand-to-hand combat on the ships. The English, on the other hand, had ships that were very maneuverable, but not nearly as heavy, didn't have the armament, didn't have the cannon power that the Spanish had. So they wanted to get way far away so that the Spanish couldn't come close to them and sort of fire long range. It was a total stalemate. Neither one of these styles of naval warfare was effective. Well, there were a series of battles that took place up the English Channel, very inconclusive. And they were heading towards Flanders or Spanish Netherlands to pick up that 50,000 man army and transport them over to England. But the Spanish Armada was starting to disintegrate, as all of these battles were very non-conclusive, but the Spanish Navy was falling apart. First of all, they had a lot of ships, but they weren't necessarily warships. They were merchant vessels, not designed for the turbulent waters of the English Channel, but mainly in the Mediterranean. Apparently their logistics people hadn't given them well-preserved food, and the water caskets leaked, and so as they progressed up the channel, they were running out of food and water. And then their cannonballs weren't even the right caliber for their cannon. And they also had not trained to fire rapid salvos the way the English could. The English could turn around, fire a cannon, and 4 minutes later fire that same cannon again, whereas the Spaniards just didn't have any idea how to do that very quick turnaround firing. So, gradual disintegration of the Spanish Armada. The Battle of Gravelines, right there, was sort of the end of the line, so to speak, for the Spaniards. They ran out of gunpowder. They had not been able to reprovision. Again, let's take a look at the location. The English, as they fired their cannons and used up their gunpowder and cannonballs and their food and water, they were able to reprovision in the nearest port. The Spaniards had no opportunity to reprovision. They would have had to go all the way back to Spain. So they were running out of gunpowder by that time. And the English realized it, and they moved in for the kill. And the Spaniards realized, we have to go home now. They couldn't sail back the way they'd come because of the entire British Navy was waiting for them. So they decided to go around above England and Ireland and sail home. The problem was, if they didn't, what's the saying? I wouldn't have any luck if I didn't have bad luck, something like that. They had the worst misfortune because they ran into one of the worst storms in the history of the North Atlantic when they came around, and their ships were wrecked along the coast of the various islands in Ireland. Half of their fleet was lost by this time. 20,000 men were captured or killed. And the English were the Spaniards who were shipwrecked and would swim ashore the English were so concerned about those Spaniards, Roman Catholics, linking up with the local people, who are also Roman Catholics, to create an insurrection on Ireland. They killed every man who swam ashore because they didn't want to take prisoners. So it was a total disaster. English, not a single ship was lost. Less than 100 men killed. It was a totally one-sided victory for the English. It was a remarkable time, and Drake again was at the height of popularity, but that was really the high water mark for him, because thereafter, failure followed failure. It's so true, you know, sometimes people reach the heights of fame and glory and success, and then for various reasons, they begin to fail, and fail quite a bit. He did. 1589, attacked Spain, Corunna, and Lisbon, total failures. Didn't gain anything. And in these years, 1595 and 1596, tried to conquer Las Palmas, the capital of the Canary Islands, didn't work. Attacked San Juan, Puerto Rico, you know, that capital, that fort, El Morro. It's really invincible. He was defeated there. Went back to Nombre de Dios, one of the sites of his earliest victories, and he captured Nombre de Dios, but there was no treasure there at that point in time. And so it was a run of terrible experiences, and it was at this point where he died. He had dysentery off the coast of Portobello. Nombre de Dios. This is a picture of that location. And his ship that was just offshore, he was dying of dysentery. He asked his aide-de-camp, put the war armor on me, and he realized that he was dying, and he was dead by sunrise. And so ended the life of one of the most remarkable men in maritime history, a man who had circumnavigated the world, the second person to do so, who had captured who really commenced the time of privateering and piracy with one of the largest hauls ever, the Cacapuego. And then also was the vice admiral. I don't think I mentioned that. He was number 2 in command of the Spanish Armada. Of the fleet that defeated the Spanish Armada. And so this one man who had accomplished so much died off the coast of Panama. And so ended this remarkable story.